Dr. Zephyrian Koltok adjusted his bioluminescent tendrils nervously as he approached the massive steel doors of the Galactic Medical Council's archive facility. His elongated frame, typical of his species from the gas giant Velthara, trembled slightly as the massive security scanners hummed to life around him. The facility was buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Nexus Prime, the administrative capital of the Galactic Federation. "State your purpose," the mechanical voice echoed through the sterile chamber. Dr. Zephyrian Kolthok, requesting access to medical files related to species classification. Human. Authorization code, Theta 779. His voice carried the melodic undertones characteristic of his people. But today, it wavered with uncertainty. The scanner beam swept over him multiple times, analyzing his genetic markers, neural patterns, and even his stress levels. After what felt like an eternity, the massive doors groaned open with a sound that reminded him of dying stellar winds. Zephyrian had been the Federation's leading xenobiologist for over 4 decades. He had studied hundreds of species, cataloged their biological quirks, and helped develop medical protocols for nearly every known sentient race in the galaxy. But humans were different. They had been classified as a restricted study species for the past 50 standard years, ever since first contact. The archive chamber stretched before him like a cathedral of knowledge. Floating data crystals lined the walls in perfect rows, each one containing the medical secrets of different species. But as he moved deeper into the facility, he noticed something odd. The human section was separated from everything else by an energy barrier that hummed with an ominous, red glow. "Dr. Kolthok," came another voice, this one distinctly organic. A figure emerged from the shadows between the data stacks. It was Commander Thrix, a Kanthari whose chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the archive lights. "I wasn't expecting anyone to request human files today. Commander, I need these files for my research. The medical board has approved my request to study human physiology for potential integration into Federation medical protocols." Zephyrian's tendrils flickered with agitation. Surely, there's nothing unusual about wanting to understand a member species better. Thrix's compound eyes focused on him with uncomfortable intensity. "Dr. Kolthok, in your 40 years of service, you've studied the regenerative capabilities of the Zephyrians of Kepler 442b, the poison immunity of the Korathi, and even the radiation resistance of the plutonium feeders of Gamma Centauri. But you've never once requested human files. Why now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zephyrian's bioluminescence dimmed as he considered his response. The truth was, since he had been having nightmares. Not the gentle dream states his species normally experienced, but violent, chaotic visions that left him trembling in his sleep pod. They had started 3 months ago, after he had briefly treated a human diplomat who had suffered injuries in a shuttle accident. "I encountered a human patient recently," he said carefully. "There were anomalies in their physiology that I couldn't explain with current Federation medical knowledge. I believe studying their files could help me provide better care, not just for humans, but for species with similar biological markers." Commander Thrix remained silent for a long moment, then gestured toward the energy barrier. "Very well. But I must warn you, Doctor. These files carry a special classification for good reason. Once you access them, you'll understand why human medical data requires such extreme security measures." As they approached the barrier, Zephyrian noticed additional warning symbols that he hadn't seen from a distance. Skull-like icons, radiation warnings, and text in multiple languages that all seemed to convey the same message. Extreme danger. Deathworld species. "Deathworld?" Zephyrian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought that classification was theoretical." "Oh, it's very real," Thrix replied grimly. "There are only 3 species in the galaxy that carry this classification: the void crawlers of the Magellanic Nebula, the crystal devourers of the Horsehead Formation, and humans. The energy barrier dissolved at their approach, and Zephyrian felt an immediate change in the atmosphere. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made his tendrils recoil instinctively. Before them stood a single data crystal, larger than any he had ever seen, pulsing with an inner light that seemed almost alive. "This contains everything the Federation knows about human physiology," Thrix explained. "Medical scans, biological analyses, psychological profiles, and incident reports from medical facilities across the galaxy. But Doctor," he paused, his mandibles clicking nervously, "once you access this information, you cannot unknow it. The human Deathworld protocol exists because knowledge of their true capabilities has historically led to panic, religious crises, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdown among medical professionals." Zephyrian stared at the crystal, his scientific curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. "What exactly am I going to find in there?" "The answer to questions you didn't even know you should be afraid to ask," Thrix replied. "The reason why humans are the only species in the galaxy that requires specialized medical facilities. The truth about why their injury reports are classified at the highest levels. And, most importantly, the explanation for why a species that evolved on what we classify as a Class 1-2 Deathworld somehow managed to develop space travel and join galactic civilization." The crystal pulsed brighter, as if sensing their presence. Around them, the archive facility's automated systems hummed ominously, and Zephyrian could swear he heard what sounded like distant screaming echoing through the data networks. "Are you certain you want to proceed?" Thrix asked, one final time. Zephyrian's tendrils trembled as he reached toward the crystal. His entire career had been built on understanding the impossible, on finding medical solutions for biological problems that seemed insurmountable. How dangerous could one species really be? His bioluminescent digits made contact with the crystal's surface, and immediately the world around him exploded into data streams, medical readings, and images that his mind struggled to process. The first file that opened made his heart stop beating for several seconds. Medical Report 1. Human Healing Rates. Warning. Anomalous data. The numbers that flowed across his vision defied everything he knew about biology, physics, and the fundamental laws of organic life. And this, he realized with growing horror, was just the beginning. The data crystal hummed with malevolent energy as information flooded directly into Zephyrian's neural pathways. His bioluminescent body flickered rapidly as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Commander Thrix stepped back, watching with the grim expression of someone who had witnessed this revelation before. The first medical report materialized in holographic detail before them. It showed a human male designated as Patient 07 Alpha, who had been admitted to a Federation medical facility, following what the report termed a minor industrial accident. Zephyrian's tendrils recoiled as he read the initial assessment. Subject arrived with complete severing of left appendage, massive blood loss equivalent to 40% of total volume, third-degree thermal burns across 60% of body surface, and multiple fractures to skeletal structure, the report stated clinically. Prognosis. Terminal. Estimated survival time. 6 minutes. But the follow-up reports made Zephyrian's bioluminescence dim to almost nothing. 24 hours later, the human's blood volume had completely restored itself. 48 hours later, new tissue was growing at the amputation site. Within a week, the thermal burns had healed without scarring. The fractures had fused stronger than before. "This is impossible," Zephyrian whispered, his voice trembling. "No species can regenerate at these rates. The energy requirements alone would." "Keep reading," Thrix said grimly. The next file opened automatically, showing metabolic data that defied physics. The human's energy consumption had increased by only 12% above normal levels. 12%. Zephyrian's own species required a 300% increase in caloric intake just to heal minor cuts. More files cascaded before him. A human female, who had survived exposure to hard vacuum for 14 minutes. Another, who had continued fighting with a severed spinal cord for 6 hours before seeking medical attention. A human child who had regenerated an entire liver after toxin exposure that should have killed them instantly. These reports, Zephyrian's voice cracked. They read like mythology. Like the ancient legends of the eternal warriors from our oldest texts. Keep going, Thrix urged, though his own compound eyes showed signs of distress. You haven't seen the psychological profiles yet. The crystal pulsed, and new data emerged. Zephyrian found himself looking at brain scans that made his tendrils writhe in confused horror. Human neural activity showed patterns that shouldn't exist in nature. Their brains processed pain differently, treating potentially lethal injuries as mere inconveniences. Their stress response systems operated in reverse of every known biological model. Subject exhibits complete suppression of survival instincts when protecting others. Read 1 psychological evaluation. Demonstrated willingness to sacrifice personal welfare for strangers' approaches, levels typically seen only in advanced artificial intelligences, programmed with species preservation protocols. However, this behavior appears to be natural and instinctive rather than programmed. File after file revealed the same terrifying pattern. Humans didn't just survive impossible situations. They thrived in them. They sought them out. Their medical reports read like catalogs of nightmare scenarios that would instantly kill any other known species. Combat Report Epsilon 7, the crystal announced. A new hologram materialized, showing a human soldier designated Sergeant Thompson, engaging hostile forces on an asteroid mining station. Zephyrian watched in horrified fascination as the human continued fighting despite injuries that should have dropped them within seconds. Subject sustained projectile wounds to lung, liver, and major blood vessels. The combat medic's report stated, continued tactical operations for 3 hours and 17 minutes before requesting medical assistance. When asked why they didn't report injuries immediately, subject stated, they didn't want to worry anyone unnecessarily. They didn't want to worry anyone, Zephyrian repeated slowly. They were dying, and they were worried about other people's emotional state? It gets worse, Thrix said, his chitinous shell clicking nervously. Access file Gamma Medical. The new file materialized with additional security warnings that made the archive chamber's lights dim automatically. It contained medical observations from first contact scenarios across dozens of worlds. Every single report followed the same disturbing pattern. Humans approached unknown environments that would immediately kill any other species. They consumed foods that would poison most galactic civilizations. They tolerated radiation levels that would sterilize entire star systems. They formed emotional bonds with predatory species that viewed them as food sources. And somehow, impossibly, they not only survived but convinced these hostile environments and creatures to become allies. Medical Protocol Alert. Human Psychological Profile. Delta, the crystal announced. Warning. Information in this file has been linked to severe psychological distress in non-human medical personnel. Mandatory counseling required for all staff exposed to this data. Despite the warning, Zephyrian accessed the file. What he found inside shattered his understanding of evolution, psychology, and the fundamental nature of sentient life. Humans possess a neurological anomaly that appears to be species-wide, the report began. They experience positive emotional responses to situations that trigger survival fears in all other known species. Pain, danger, and potential death activate reward pathways in their brains. They seek out experiences that would terrify other sentients. The file contained interview transcripts with human patients that read like confessions from beings possessed by benevolent madness. Why did you choose to explore the unstable quantum cave system? The interviewer asked one human. Because it was there, came the reply. Because no one else could. Because someone needed to see what was inside. Were you not concerned about the 97% fatality rate of previous expeditions? Those odds seemed pretty good to me. Zephyrian's bioluminescence began flickering in patterns associated with severe distress among his species. The implications of what he was reading went beyond medical anomalies. These weren't just biological aberrations. These were evolutionary impossible. "Commander," he said, his voice barely audible. "These reports suggest that humans evolved specifically to survive in conditions that would exterminate other species. But that's not how evolution works. Species evolve to fit their environment, not to conquer environments that actively try to kill them." "Now you're beginning to understand why these files are classified," Thrix replied. "Access the final medical file. The one labeled Origin Point Analysis." The crystal pulsed one final time, and the most restricted file in the human medical database opened before them. What Zephyrian saw inside made his bioluminescent form go completely dark for the first time in his adult life. Geological Survey Report. Planet Earth. Human Homeworld. Classification. The data that followed read like a description of hell itself. Surface gravity that would crush most species. An atmosphere that was literally poisonous to 90% of known life forms. Weather patterns that included frozen precipitation, electrical storms that could power small cities, and wind currents capable of leveling mountains. Seismic activity that could split continents. And somehow, in this nightmare landscape, humans hadn't just survived. They had thrived. They had built civilizations. They had created art, music, and literature, while living on a world that the Federation classified as uninhabitable by any rational measure. "This is why," Thrix said quietly, "humans are the only species in the galaxy that requires specialized medical protocols. Not because they're weak or fragile, but because they're so impossibly resilient that standard medical procedures don't work on them. Their bodies automatically assume that any injury is survivable and begin healing processes that operate on principles we don't understand." Zephyrian stared at the data, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about biology, about life itself, had just been fundamentally challenged. And then, with growing horror, he realized what this meant for his original patient, the human diplomat he had treated 3 months ago. The one whose injuries had seemed to heal impossibly fast. The one who had thanked him for his care, while suffering from wounds that should have been agonizing. "Commander," he whispered, "if humans are this resilient, this capable of surviving impossible conditions, what happens when they actually get sick?" Commander Thrix's compound eyes dilated as he registered the full implications of Zephyrian's question. The archive chamber seemed to grow colder around them, and the data crystal pulsed with an urgent red light that cast ominous shadows across the walls. "Doctor," Thrix said slowly, "that's exactly the question that led to the creation of the Deathworld protocol in the first place." The crystal responded to their conversation, automatically accessing files that carried even higher security classifications. New holograms materialized around them, showing medical facilities across the galaxy. But these weren't ordinary hospitals. They were massive, fortress-like structures that looked more like military installations than healing centers. "When humans actually become ill," Thrix continued, "the results are catastrophic. Not for them, but for everything around them. Their immune systems don't just fight disease, they weaponize it." The first new file that opened made Zephyrian's bioluminescent organs flicker in confusion. It showed a human patient in what appeared to be a standard Federation medical facility. The human was unconscious, connected to monitoring equipment, and appeared to be suffering from what the report classified as minor respiratory distress. Patient exhibits common viral infection, estimated severity 0.2 on the Federation medical scale. The initial assessment read, projected recovery time. But the follow-up reports painted a very different picture. Within 6 hours, every piece of medical equipment in the facility had mysteriously improved its efficiency. The air filtration systems had somehow evolved to process toxins they weren't designed to handle. The walls themselves had begun secreting a substance that accelerated healing in other patients. The human immune system, Thrix explained, doesn't just adapt to threats. It actively modifies its environment to eliminate them. When a human gets sick, Their body begins producing compounds that sterilize everything within a considerable radius. Other species began showing spontaneous immunity to diseases they'd never encountered. Zephyrian stared at the data, his scientific mind struggling to process the implications. You're telling me that human illness is contagious, but instead of spreading disease, it spreads immunity? That's exactly what I'm telling you. But it gets worse. Thrix gestured, and new files opened. Access Medical Incident Report, Omega-1. The hologram that materialized showed a Federation medical ship, the kind used to transport critical patients across star systems. According to the timestamp, it had been carrying a human patient, suffering from what the report termed severe systemic organ failure, to a specialist facility on Kepler 438b. Patient condition deteriorated during transport, the report stated. However, unusual readings began appearing throughout ship systems. Engine efficiency increased by 40%. Life support systems began operating at previously impossible optimization levels. Ship's computer reported spontaneous upgrades to processing capabilities. Zephyrian's tendrils went rigid. The ship itself was healing? The human's immune response had spread to the ship's biological components, Thrix confirmed. By the time they reached their destination, the medical ship had essentially evolved into a more advanced version of itself. The Federation Science Council spent 3 years studying that vessel before they understood what had happened. More files cascaded before them, each one more impossible than the last. A human child with a fever had caused an entire space station's ecosystem to spontaneously develop immunity to a plague that had been ravaging the sector. A human scientist with a mild infection had somehow triggered evolutionary adaptations in laboratory specimens that led to breakthrough discoveries in regenerative medicine. This is why, Thrix said, his voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge, human medical facilities look like military installations. They're not just hospitals, they're containment facilities. When humans get seriously ill, their immune systems can accidentally upgrade the biology of everything around them. Plants become more efficient. Animals develop new capabilities. Even artificial intelligences report spontaneous improvements when exposed to human medical distress. The crystal pulsed again, and a new classification appeared. Project Prometheus. Classified beyond top secret. Doctor, Thrix said carefully, what you're about to see is the reason why the Federation Council debates whether humanity should be classified as a weapon of mass construction. The file that opened contained reports from across the galaxy, all following the same pattern. Human colonies didn't just survive on hostile worlds. They transformed them. Planets that had been barren wastelands became garden worlds within generations. Ecosystems that had been dying were restored to vibrant health. Species on the brink of extinction suddenly displayed remarkable resilience when humans settled nearby. They're not just survivors, Zephyrian whispered, his understanding crystallizing into something approaching awe. They're universal healers. Their very presence improves biological systems. And that, Thrix said grimly, is what terrifies the Federation Council. A species that can accidentally improve everything around them just by existing. Do you understand the implications? The power balance shifts? The questions about whether human expansion is conquest or inadvertent biological warfare? Zephyrian thought about his original patient, the human diplomat. The one who had thanked him for treatment while suffering injuries that should have been excruciating. The one whose presence had somehow made Zephyrian's own equipment work more efficiently for weeks afterward. The nightmares, he said suddenly. I've been having nightmares ever since treating that human patient. But they weren't nightmares about violence or death. They were dreams about becoming something better, something stronger. Thrix nodded grimly. Exposure to human medical distress triggers evolutionary pressure responses in other species. Your nightmares weren't nightmares at all. They were your body trying to adapt, trying to become more like them. It's why the Deathworld protocol exists. Prolonged exposure to humans, especially humans under medical duress, can fundamentally alter other species. The crystal displayed one final file, and Zephyrian realized why the security around human medical data was so extreme. The file showed a graph tracking the biological development of species that had joined the Federation before and after human contact. Every single species showed marked improvements in regeneration rates, disease resistance, and environmental adaptability. Humanity, Thrix said quietly, is accidentally uplifting every species they encounter. Not through technology or education, but through simple, biological proximity. Their presence makes everything around them more resilient, more capable, more alive. Zephyrian stared at the data, feeling his worldview fundamentally shifting. That's why they're restricted. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're too beneficial. Because contact with them changes other species in ways we don't understand or control. Exactly. And that's why these files are classified at the highest levels. Because if the galaxy knew the truth about humans, every species would want to live near them. Wars would be fought for the right to human proximity. Civilizations would collapse as everyone abandoned their homeworlds to seek out human colonies. The crystal began to dim, signaling the end of the data download. But as it did, new information flooded Zephyrian's consciousness. Medical protocols he had never learned. Treatment methods that seemed to operate on principles beyond current Federation science. His own biology was adapting, incorporating knowledge from the human files in ways that shouldn't be possible. "Doctor," Thrix said, concern evident in his voice, "we need to get you to decontamination immediately. Exposure to human medical data has biological effects. You're going to need specialized treatment to prevent unwanted evolutionary adaptations." But as they moved toward the exit, Zephyrian realized something that made him stop in his tracks. He felt better than he had in years. Stronger. More capable. His bioluminescent organs were glowing brighter than they had since his youth. Even his nervous system felt more efficient. "Commander," he said slowly, "I think I understand now why humans don't see their resilience as remarkable. If this is what brief exposure to their medical data does to other species, imagine what generations of evolution in their presence could accomplish." They stood in the archive chamber, surrounded by the classified secrets of humanity's impossible biology. Both of them grappling with the same terrifying realization. Humans weren't just survivors of a Deathworld. They were agents of universal biological improvement, walking catalysts for evolution, who could accidentally transform entire civilizations simply by existing near them. And somewhere in the galaxy, human colonies continued to expand, their inhabitants completely unaware that their presence was quietly making everything around them better, stronger, and more alive than it had ever been before. The Deathworld Protocol wasn't designed to protect the galaxy from human aggression. It was designed to manage the consequences of humanity's involuntary gift for making everything they touched more capable of surviving in an inherently hostile universe. As they left the archive chamber, Zephyrian carried with him not just forbidden knowledge, but the beginning of biological changes that would make him stronger, more resilient, and more human than any member of his species had ever been before.